So good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us this morning to learn more about risk assessments for project management. Our presenter this morning is Cher Powers from the Ontario Centre of Innovation. Cher is an experienced professional with extensive project management and operations management, as well as partnership development experience with the Canadian innovation ecosystem. Many of you based in the Kingston or Eastern Ontario area have probably had some interactions with Cher. She has over 16 years of experience working with startups and SMEs to help develop and scale up their operations and technologies. Cher has presented a workshop for our weekend project late last year on project management. So if you haven't seen that, I will pop that into the chat. It links to our YouTube channel where we have a lot of other business-related videos. So I'll hand it over to Cher and I'll pop that link in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Amanda, and thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great to see. I see there's a mix of familiar and new names and faces here. So, yeah, happy to provide this session. This is really casual, the same as the project management session that I provided for weekend in the fall. Is there anybody here? Maybe you could pop it in the chat if there's anybody here who attended that session. Anybody? No? Okay, because I am going to refer a little bit to that, but like Amanda said, she will pop the link to that YouTube video in the chat. What you'll notice is if you get to the end of that video, I did it from home, you'll hear my dog barking and me having to throw treats at my dog to get him to stop barking. So that's kind of how casual it is here. But I do also need to apologize. I had something after New Year's and I wasn't well and my voice is still a little bit shaky and I have a bit of a dry throat and cough. So hopefully my voice holds out here. And while I'm presenting, as you know, I can't see you guys. So please feel free to jump in anytime. If you have a question, just hop on. And then I can try to answer it then. Then we'll also have time for question and answer period at the end of the presentation. As Amanda said, this is kind of a risk management session related to project management, but also similar to the project management session in the fall that I provided. These tools that I'm going to show you and this information and bits of processes are also very useful for operations management. So, and strategic planning. So, normally when you think about what a project is and what the definition is, they say it's not regular operations management type stuff because, a project has a beginning and an end, has a budget, it's time bound and all of that good stuff. But when you think about, strategic plans nowadays, and then even an annual operating plan, there is a beginning and an end. And there is usually a budget associated with that, and then you have a timeline. So you can use some of the same tools, maybe with just a few adjustments, to help not just with, say, specific project management, but operations and strategic planning as well. This here is the agenda. We're going to have a little bit of an overview. Then we're going to talk about identifying risks, and then risk assessment and risk response. So jumping right in, I'll go into presentation mode, but I am going to maybe flip back and forth into other documents in the beginning. So maybe I'll wait until that flipping back and forth is done. So the risk management process is all about obviously reducing risk. And same with project management. When you get into project management, the whole purpose of, doing a really good project plan and having a really good scope and definition of that is all about reducing risk and the potential for those risk events and achieving a good outcome. So as many of you know here, like a risk is something that's uncertain. It's not really something that you can always plan for, and it may come out of the blue, and sometimes it's out of our control. But if you try to manage those risks, you identify them, you assess them, and you talk about, how you might handle them if they occur. then that's, risk management comes in because that's an attempt to kind of go through, what could go wrong, all the what ifs of a situation, how you can minimize their impact, and what can be done before the event occurs, like kind of anticipating them, and then what you can do when they occur and maybe having some contingency plans. As we know, the thing with, identifying the risks and then having that contingency planning, knowing how you would handle that risk event if it occurs, you would have a better outcome and make a better decision. Because what people tend to find is if it's unexpected and you don't have a plan and you're put on the spot and you have to make an unexpected decision, it might not be the best one. Whereas if you had thought about that ahead of time and done some planning, then you'll have a better decision and a better outcome related to that risk event happening. So benefits of risk management, it is really a proactive approach. So being proactive rather than reactive, it does reduce surprises and negative consequences. It prepares the project manager or the operations manager, or say perhaps a sole proprietor, CEO, to take advantage of appropriate risks and provides better control over, the future and improves the chances of reaching your objectives, whether they're project objectives, deliverables and milestones, or objectives within an operational plan or strategic plan, strategic priorities. It helps you achieve those within budget and on time. What I will say, and I think I have this in a slide further down, is not all risks are negative. Risks can also be positive opportunities that occur unexpectedly. So that's just also something to keep in mind, but also something where if you try to maybe anticipate them, then you'll have a better response if that opportunity arises and in knowing how you're going to deal with it and be better prepared for that. So this is where I'm risk assessment, we're talking about project management, but then also we're talking about how that relates and how the tools can be used for strategic planning and operational planning. And I just wanted to throw this up because you guys are all familiar here with a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is something you often see in a strategic plan. But when you think about what's in a SWOT, that also gives you a good basis to begin thinking about what those risks are that can occur, whether it is in your project or an operational plan. So, your strengths and weaknesses are usually internal factors. And then your opportunities and threats are usually external forces or factors. And when you're looking at that in a strategic plan, then you could start to see if you were doing an operational plan and you wanted to do some risk planning and assessment and include that as kind of a operational plan workbook, then your strategic plan in this SWOT is a good place to start. So this is where I am going to flip, and hopefully you'll be able to see. Okay, so can you guys see a spreadsheet now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So this is something that I provided and talked about in the project management session in the fall, relating project management to strategic planning and relating operational management and operational plans, to project management and using those same tools. So this is an operating plan template. And I just wanted to pull this up and then show you that that's something that I can provide you after. And when you go through your strategic plan and you see that SWOT analysis and you're going to create an operating plan, perhaps you can add a tab. You see the tabs along the bottom where you have, your funding, your budget, your deliverables, KPIs, financial statements, perhaps. You can also add a tab for a risk management matrix or assessment or a little bit of a contingency plan around that. So just something that can also be available to you if you'd like. So any questions on that before we dive into the risk management process? No? Okay. Okay, so yeah, jumping right in. So the risk management process, this again, in relation to strategic planning, this is a good place for this to happen. When you're doing a project, you would kind of, start thinking about the risks when you're doing the scoping and definition of the project. And then when you jump into the planning process, you're going to get into doing a full risk management process for that project plan. But when you talk about operational and strategic planning on the business side, outside of specific one-off projects that you might have within that, risk management process and these types of identification, assessment, and response can also be part of strategic planning as well. And especially when you're thinking about that SWOT analysis and then also deciding on what your strategic priorities might be for an organization based on certain risk factors that you've identified. So walking through this table from top to bottom, you can see the first step when it in the risk management process is risk identification. And this is where you're going to analyze your project or analyze, say, your mission and vision and kind of your strategic plan and identify any sources of risk. And then once you do that and you have those risks and you have a list and they're known, then what you're going to do is you're going to step 2 is assess those risks. And, you would maybe assess, if one happens, what the severity of the impact would be, what is the likelihood of it occurring, and can you really control it? And then based on that assessment, you have maybe your high, medium, and low occurrence risks, and then you have that in relation to the severity of their impact. Then you can start to develop a risk response plan and different strategies to reduce the damage or the opportunity or, exploit the opportunity if it occurs, and then start to develop those contingency plans. And then you get into, risk management. So you have that assessment, and then if a risk event occurs, you have your plan, and then you have your response, and you can control that response. So that's where you would implement one of those strategies you thought of in step 3, and then possibly monitor or do change management requirements. So that first phase, step 1, managing risk. This is where, again, you're identifying those risks. So at this phase, you're generating a list of possible risks, and you're doing this through, brainstorming, problem identification, maybe risk profiling. And you're usually, when you're part of a project team, you're doing this as a group. And because the more minds, the better, the more perspectives, the better. There are often, as people look at things from a different perspective or come up with different ideas. So always good to do that within your project team or within your core, either management team, or if you're at the strategic planning phase at maybe perhaps at a board of director level. And we're going to talk about a few tools. I'm going to show them, in subsequent slides that you can use that you'll have kind of in your back pocket. And one of those is a risk breakdown structure, which in relation to project planning is very similar to a work breakdown structure. If any of you are familiar with that and have used that tool in the past. It's really just a nice visual that shows kind of high-level milestones, deliverables, and then work packages and nitty-gritty actions that need to take place. And then there's also the risk profile and then some other matrices that we'll talk about in the subsequent slides. But until you see it, it's better to talk about them when we have them in front of us. So types of risk. So before we get into the tools, wanted to talk about some types of risks. And risks, as I mentioned in relation to the SWOT as well, can be external or they can be internal to the organization. And here there's a couple of examples of those main high-level types of risk or those buckets that risks can fall into. One of them being technical. So in your project or in your operations, you can have, the risk of technology failing. In this day and age, there's a huge risk. Most of us are exposed at any given time to different cyber attacks or, compromising of data, things like that. Then in relation to types of risk, there are scheduling risks. So, these are things that can affect your timeline, can affect, you basically any contingency that you've incorporated into that timeline, the finish date, finishing the project on time, and then possibly even causing a little bit of scope creep. Then there are costs related to budget, so cost risks. So, these could be anywhere from price fluctuations, supply chain issues, interest rate fluctuations that we've seen most recently. A lot of people are concerned about the tariffs and what that will do to the cost of goods and even trading across the border. So that would be an example of maybe not something internal, but external. And so their cost risks are often one of the main risks that people would consider in relation to either to a project or operations. And then we also have funding risks, somewhat related to cost risks, but if you're talking about, say, a research project and you're relying on a supply of, government funds or a grant or something like that, then you would also have to consider risks of possibly if that government funding was suddenly discontinued, or, suddenly wasn't available for renewal, if you were relying on it for, more than multiple applications or more than multiple projects. So there are also the risks of funding. So any questions on those types of risks? Does anybody have any other examples of anything specific or any type of risk that you've either that's different than these buckets or anything that falls within either funding, cost, or scheduling or technical risks? No? Okay. Great, we'll move on. So this is kind of the first tool within this whole risk assessment process that I think would be good for people to know about and that you could use. Also, what I like about this type of tool is that it doesn't require you to purchase any new software. It doesn't require you to have any project management software or anything separate that you might not already have. It's a tool that can be done within apps that you already have. Like it can be done in a PowerPoint slide, it can be done in Word, it can be done in Excel. But this is the risk breakdown structure. And like I said, for those of you who may be familiar with work breakdown structure in project management, the risk breakdown structure is very similar in that it provides a good hierarchical visual of either your project or if it's operations management, your operating plan, and then high level type of risks, and then those types of risks organized by the specific risk event underneath it. You'll see here that the types of risks listed are technical, external, organizational, and then project type specific. You could also use those risk categories here instead. So you could use technical, schedule, cost, or funding. And you could use those as your high-level types of risk, or you could organize it this way with technical, external, organizational, and project management. You could also color code. So if you did it this way, but some of them were scheduling, costs, or funding, then you could color code, and then you could get a really good visual snapshot that you could not only use for yourself, but share with any project team or any operations team, any other stakeholders that had interest in this, or any potential funders or investors, what those risks are. And that shows also that you've planned and you have a good handle on that, and you'll be prepared if one occurs. So we're moving kind of now from risk identification into assessment. So right here, so you've identified all your risks and you have them classified into their buckets and their types. So now you're going to go into that step 2 in that original diagram that I showed you, where you're going to assess your risks. And this is more, I would say, in my opinion, usually not something that happens at the strategic level. So not during the strategic planning process or at the board level. We're getting into now, it's like, okay, we have that strategic plan. There's been the SWOT analysis done, or you have a project plan. You're starting your project plan, you're moving on, getting close to the end of that. You have a good handle on the scope and the budget and all of the other variables. You've identified your risks and you're getting into the risk assessment. So kind of more on the operations side, and then on the end of the project planning process side when you're talking about the life of a project. So for the risk assessment section of this, we're going to do, this is where you can do the scenario analysis for, like I said, the probability or the impact of those risks that you've identified. And we're going to talk about a couple of tools, the risk assessment form and the risk severity matrix that will help you do that and help you see what the impact would be if a risk event occurs or what the probability is in relation to the impact. Because that helps you decide as well what risks you're going to focus on. Because depending on the size of your project or the extent of your operations plan and in your organization, there may be many risks, and there may be some where you decide, okay, well, this is so minimal or the impact is minimal. We can't focus our time and energy on developing a plan for every single one of them. We're going to focus on these high priority or high impact ones or high probability risks. Okay, so this here is another tool. And so what this is, you have that risk breakdown structure and you have those risks identified, whether they be by cost, time, scope, or quality, or whatever you want to use. If it's like, time or cost or external or internal, whatever those factors are that you've organized your risks under, those buckets. Here you can start to associate them with the probability of them occurring and what might happen. And then you can even associate numbers to that. So you can do a little bit of even if you're a math person or a numbers person, you could do a little bit of a calculation that helps you prioritize those risks based on the information here. You can come up like this is kind of a template, but depending on your own unique circumstance, either the variables or the criteria that you include here could be different, but this just gives you an idea of how you can relate that impact of the risk to the ones that you've identified. Another more simple risk assessment form that you could use is you could just list your risk event here and the likelihood and the impact. And then another criteria that we didn't really talk about is, how easy or difficult it might be to detect that risk. So how much you might need to watch out for it. And again, you can associate a number scale with that. You could either do, 1 to 5 or 1 to 3 or whatever you'd want. You could do percentages. And then there's another column here we haven't talked about, but when you're doing either project planning or in your operational planning, you can also have a consideration for when that risk might occur. Is it going to occur, at the beginning of the project, the middle, or the end? Or it could occur, anywhere during your operational plan for that year. Because operational plans tend to be annual, where strategic plans tend to be, 3 to 5 years or whatever. But that reminds me, what I should also say when I'm talking about all these types of tools and all of these plans, whether it be for strategic and operational planning or whether it be for project management and specific project planning, the documents that you create and use, I always like to tell everybody they're not set in stone. They're living documents, and it's not an issue, or it shouldn't be an issue, to go back and revisit them on a regular basis and update them if need be, particularly when we're talking about strategic and operational planning. Things change, and things change very quickly. And it used to be that people would have 5-year strategic plans, and then it became more of the norm to have 3-year. And now people are talking about 18 months to 24 months for strategic plan, because things change so quickly and because they're always going back. But even when you doesn't matter how long the duration is, those documents are organic, they're living, and they can be updated and should be updated and revisited several times. So another tool that you can have in your back pocket to be aware of, something that also gives a good visual and helps, associate the impact with the likelihood, and then maybe prioritizing which risks you're going to focus on, is this risk severity matrix. So, the likelihood of it happening, they have a scale here, 1 to 5. I have a scale here, 1 to 5. And then the impact, the scale is 1 to 5. And then when you start associating risk with those, so say a risk here in this example, the likelihood of it happening is pretty high because it's a 4, and the impact is a 3. So it's kind of in that gray area. So yeah, it's a concern, but not as much of a concern, more of a concern than these low impact, low likelihood, but not as a concern as the ones here in the red zone, where it would be, the likelihood of it happening is high and the impact could be high. So, maybe depending on how many risks are in your project or in your operating plan, you may decide only to concentrate on creating contingency plans for the ones that end up in the red zone. Or maybe have like a less of a plan, but some considerations for the one in the brown zone. And then these ones you're just going to accept and they'll have little impact or likelihood to occur. So you don't want to put too much brain power or time or resources into thinking about those in your overall plan. So we're going to move in now to the step 3, risk response developing. And so before we do that, does anybody have any questions on those tools or, the kind of identification and assessment of risks?
Hi, Cher.
Hello.
Prashant here. And this is something I've struggled with personally, and this relates to just the identification part, especially for startups where when we're trying to identify risks, I find it difficult to identify certain risks for something that we haven't done yet. If you're planning 1 year or 1.5 year, 2 years in advance for something such as scale up, which we haven't done it yet. So I find it difficult to identify certain risks that could come with those tasks. Once I've identified certain risks, coming up with a strategy, I find it easier. What would you suggest would be the best way to identify certain risks?
Okay, when you're trying to identify, are you working kind of on your own or with a team or with other stakeholders and partners? Like who's having input on that identification?
It depends. If it's a technology risks, that's usually me. If it's a financial risks, that's other member of the team. So different risks are taken up by different members of the team. So I am right now, for example, talking about technology risks.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say, like I said before, the more people involved in kind of that identification, the better. So even people who don't
Right.
necessarily have expertise. So if you're talking about technology risks, say, okay, so you want somebody who has the technical expertise in relation to your subject matter and your company and what you need. Sorry, I'm gonna have to plug in my computer. But then it's also good to have, a group of, or you have perspectives from other people who don't necessarily have that expertise. Maybe they're from a different domain or a different sector, but they kind of have that different viewpoint of a higher level. So, oftentimes if you're talking to the experts in a subject or whatnot, they're down in the weeds and you need those other people from outside of that sector or that domain to kind of pull them back up, and think broader and other levels. So I would say the more people, the better. And then having those, like with those different perspectives of people who are, have that nitty gritty on the ground in the weeds knowledge, but then have the people from outside who can kind of pull them back up and think larger.
Right.
Does that help?
Thanks. Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
And I would include like as many stakeholders as you can or advisors that you have or whoever. And you actually reminded me of what I should say too, is that, with your strategic planning, your strategic planning is kind of at that 30,000 foot. And then when you get to, the operational planning, it's usually on the ground. And then all of this other stuff we're talking about here is, up till now is like in between. So you're starting at the high level and you're bringing it down. So having those people with that high level perspective outside can really help in the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. So now we're jumping into risk response development. So when a risk event occurs, and remember I said not all risks are bad, sometimes risk events can present opportunities. There are different ways that you can choose to respond. So you could either choose to mitigate the risk, you could choose to avoid the risk, you could choose to transfer it, or you can choose to accept it. So when you've gone through the identification and assessment, you've decided on the risks you're going to focus on because they're the ones, maybe are the ones that are most likely to need a response. Then you could also, to your plan or to whatever tool you're using, add a column for what response you would most likely give to that. So some of them would be, if you're going to mitigate it, that means you want to try to reduce the likelihood that will occur and reducing the impact in case it does. But if you're avoiding it, then if you decide, okay, this is a risk we're just going to completely avoid, you may change the project or change your plan to just say, okay, we want to avoid it, so we're not going to do that at all. We're going to take that right out. So this kind of harkens back to when I had said, in the strategic plan, doing that kind of high level risk identification in relation to the SWOT can help you, even at that high level, and that's beginning stage of planning, decide maybe it's some risks they want to completely avoid and some strategic priorities or things that they're not even going to pursue or do because maybe they don't want to be in that business or they don't want to take on that risk. It's too much. And then another response, like I said, transferring the risk. So this could be in relation to, you're transferring the risk to another party. You know what might happen, but if it does, then maybe you have insurance. So you're transferring that risk to an insurance company or passing it on to another party. Or if you're working in partnership with somebody, then that risk becomes their responsibility. And then you can accept the risk, which is making a conscious decision just to say, okay, this is going to happen. We know it's going to happen. So these are the things we're going to do when it does. And you're happy with that. So when you do decide that you're going to, either accept it or, you're going to try to mitigate the risk, then you need to get into some contingency planning. And contingency planning, as we all know, is kind of those alternate plans. Okay, so this happens. So how are we going to handle it and what do we do? And it's really about, what decisions we would make and what actions we would take to reduce the impact or the consequences when it occurs, or maybe even reduce the chance that it may occur. And then, we talk about contingency plans a lot, even in like project planning or project management, in strategic planning, operational planning. And so I think we all know that the risks of not having them can be pretty significant because it can slow down your response. And like I said, it can previously decisions made under pressure, if you don't have a plan response or you haven't considered it, can often be more dangerous and costly. So, when you get to this point and you're deciding on your risk response for those assessed risks, taking that extra step and that time then to come up with those contingency plans is really beneficial and time well spent. It's kind of like when you're doing your project planning. So if you think about the life cycle of a project, you have first phase is project definition, then it's project planning, then it's project execution, and then it's project closure. And that contingency planning, in relation to project management, that project planning phase is the most critical. It's where you usually spend the most time. And if you want to have a successful project to execute on and to close, you need to spend the time in that planning phase. Is time well worth it? And so that's really, important phase. And it's kind of like this contingency planning is part of that. So this is the time that you need to spend so that when you get to either executing on your project or your plan, it goes more smoothly and you have a better chance of having a great outcome. So a little bit more on contingency planning. Most of you, I think I don't need to talk about this too much. You can, have contingency funds. So, in relation to your budget, and then you can also have contingency for time built into a schedule. So contingency funds. So there's a couple of things to consider here. So there's funds to cover either project risks that are identified or unknown. So sometimes what people do, I wouldn't recommend, like, and nobody recommends obviously padding a budget or padding an estimate or whatnot, but it's having a contingency fund of a percentage maybe of the overall budget that can just give you a little bit of buffer in case something does require more resources is always a good idea. You know, you often see people add 5 or 10% onto an overall budget to be a contingency fund if needed. But then there are also contingency funds, depending on the size of an organization or a project, could be budget reserves that are kind of, you know, there in the background that, you know, could be available. So not necessarily built into the project budget, but can be there to bail you out. And then same with management reserves. They're large funds that can be used to cover major unforeseen expenses, like a major change in a project scope or a total project, or perhaps overall budget of an operations plan because something unexpected occurred. And then in relation to time buffers, so the amounts of time that are used to compensate for kind of unplanned delays in the project schedule are always good to have because, you know, you're always good to have that bit of a buffer because again, there are so many unknowns. And these are kind of the ones, like maybe back to Prashant's question. Oftentimes, the risk associated with unexpected scheduling issues or unexpected unavailability of people, like human resources, are often those risks that are really unknown or hard to identify. Like you never know if somebody could leave an organization or somebody could leave a project team or somebody could suddenly be sick and not available for months or externally there could be, you know, a major project partner or customer or supply chain company that suddenly is not available and that can cause huge delays in time. And those are really hard to anticipate and ones that often can have the most impact on either a project or operations. Okay, so any questions on that before we move into this tool? Okay. So this should look familiar to you by now. Very basic tool again. You don't need to purchase any software. You can use whatever you have with your current resources and create a risk response matrix. Or you could add another column on to say your identification and assessment table that you've already created. And again, this lists the risk event, but then it also states, you know, how you're going to respond to that, if you're going to mitigate it or if you're going to accept it, maybe or whatnot. And then your contingency plan, and then what the trigger would be. And this goes even further, which is really helpful. It's like, who's responsible? So if you have this snapshot too, as well, of your risk response matrix, and you have somebody listed as who's responsible, then everybody kind of knows and they can hone in and really think about and put more thought into their risk event that they're going to be responsible for. And then that also helps again with that decision making I was talking about, where, you know, if you have this plan in place and that person knows they're responsible, they'll make a better decision when that time comes if the risk event occurs. So similar to kind of managing the risk that we would traditionally think of, which would be kind of negative risk events. So when we talked about what those responses would be, there are also responses in relation to those opportunity risk events and opportunity management. So similar to that slide where we talked about how you would respond to a risk, if you wanted to respond to an opportunity, you can choose to either exploit it or you can share it. You can enhance it or you can accept it. So if you exploit it, you're seeking to eliminate the uncertainty and kind of associated with that opportunity and ensure that it definitely happens. So you kind of see that that opportunity might occur and you want to try to make sure that that happens either in your operations or in your project. Or you could share it and allocate some of the ownership or opportunity to another party who is best able to capture the opportunity. So this might be a good one where you're thinking about, say, again, if we come back to a research project, you're working with a partner and there's a chance of developing new IP or improving upon IP in that project. Part of your risk management might be thinking about that opportunity. You're hoping that it's going to come, and if it does, thinking about how you're going to handle that. And oftentimes we talk about, sharing that, okay, or who's going to own the IP or who's going to own the improvements and whatnot. So again, that's that's a really good IP, and development of it in a research project is a really good example of a risk event that could be an opportunity that you might want to consider in your planning. And then you could choose to enhance it. And then you could also just accept it and be willing to take advantage of the opportunity if it occurs, but not really actively pursuing it or not to make it happen. But if it does, great. And I know it can be hard this takes a bit sometimes for me too, to think about opportunities in relation to risk management. It can be a little bit counterintuitive, and it's hard to incorporate in your plan. So, I mean, just kind of being aware that this exists and possibly, considering it in your plan is good, but I know it can be a little bit hard to think about in relation to risk. So we're on to step 4, risk management. So you've done all of your planning, you've identified, you've assessed, you've come up with your responses, and then, the risk occurs. And so you have your response plan. And so then this is where kind of like the execution phase of a project, this is where you're going to hop into gear. Whoever is listed as responsible for that risk, is going to start executing that strategy, maybe monitoring the events, initiating the contingency plan, and then possibly watching for new risks that might be a result, or maybe reassessing the risk because it's a result of the one risk event occurring. So again, kind of an organic thing, risk plan not set in stone, because if a risk event occurs, it could trigger a whole new set of risks that you need to consider and plan for again. So you kind of have to go back and adjust that document. But in relation to risk response, and this is something a little bit extra that I had added on here, is when you're talking about risk response, it also then involves or gets you thinking about, okay, what is the process when it happens? Is there in relation to change management, and maybe having a system in place for change management. So I've just popped a little bit of information in here. If you want to establish a change management system where you can monitor, track, and report risks, but then also kind of have then the infrastructure and the templates, and then possibly the data and the information that you can that can evolve, but then can also help with future planning or future risks, because you have the learning from doing and you have that documented. And also similar to project planning and risk management, if you have change management systems in place, then you're more likely to have a better outcome. And it really helps as kind of a communication tool with your project team or your perhaps board of directors or any other stakeholders or customers that are involved in your project or in your operations. So change control management could be needed because risk events occur. Those are sources of changes, and you need to implement the contingency plan, or perhaps sometimes you're doing changes for improvement. So, within your organization, this is kind of more related to operational management, but you've got some kind of improvements that are going to require changes. So if you do want to kind of implement a change management system and some processes, this is just a list here where, that can guide you in your thinking on that, and things that you would need to consider. So you would need to identify those changes. Maybe it's as a result of a risk, or maybe it's just self-induced where you want to make some changes operationally. You could list them, you would review and evaluate, negotiate and resolve, any kind of conflicts that may arise from that change, and communicate with all parties. Communication, obviously, as we all know, is very important in not only in operations, but also in project management. Then assign responsibility for those changes, adjust your schedules, either your budget, your schedule, your project plan, your risk matrix, your operational plan, whatever it would be. and then continue to track that changes as they're implemented, which sometimes can become a little kind of project on itself, can also become a little bit of scope creep. So something to think about there and consider in relation to change management. But hopefully if you have good systems in place, it doesn't impact or create scope creep too much. So on that note, I just wanted to share another tool in Excel here that we could circulate after if anybody's interested. Again, very rudimentary, very simple, using Excel, so no other kind of database needed or software. But this is something in relation to change management that you can create that is kind of aligns with that list that I had just provided you, where you can have a snapshot for all of your stakeholders or your team for the reason for the changes, who's responsible, who those stakeholders are, timeline, budget impact, risks, and then, communications required, and then maybe have, a line if somebody needs to review this and approve it and sign off on those changes. This is just, pretty simple, but you can also add whatever you needed to. This could become part of that overall when you're talking about project plan or operating plan. It can become a tab in here as well, so you have everything in one spot. So I know the benefits of software is that you can pull out information and in either project management tools or CRMs or whatever it is, you can pull out information to slice and dice. So you can create reports, which is great. But if you don't have the resources to be able to purchase those, it's also nice to have these workbooks where you can keep all of these planning elements in one spot. So it's all in one tiny package for you. So there, back to my slides. And then I'll circulate these slides after, but I just had some key terms here as well that we kind of went through. That's just a legacy. I should have probably taken that other legacy from my course teachings, but that's it for the formal part. So now I'll stop sharing and we can hop into question and answers if anybody has any questions or any comments, or even if you wanted to share an experience that you've had in relation to risk management or assessment that could help the group. Because I know what helps entrepreneurs and CEOs or researchers is hearing about the learnings of others or people who have learned from their mistakes. That's also very helpful. Does anybody have any questions, comments? I see, Santu, you had here third party or contractor risk. You had a comment there. What were you thinking or meaning by that comment? What was that related to?
So what I'm thinking is like you contract out something, for example, some studies you want to do for your R&D, and there's a delay, unprecedented delay, or there's a cost change or personnel change. So how do we handle those situations?
Yeah, that's interesting because when you talk about contracting out, that's one way of transferring the risk, right? Because say you can't do it, you're contracting out, that contractor is now taking on the risk. So when we looked at those risk responses, you're transferring it out. So that's your response to maybe a risk, but then in and of itself, it creates a whole new risk in that, okay, you're transferring that to them, but if something happens to that contractor or organization, then what do you do? So it's something that you would need to consider even though you've transferred it out. And those ones, most of the time it's external and out of your control. So it would just be, again, having a backup plan or a contingency plan on what you would do if that transfer of risk falls through. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I had a question that relates to some of the funding applications we have submitted.
Okay.
One of the questions that's usually asked when we're asked to write risk identification and management strategies is funding risks, which is to say, what if the funding that you're applying for falls through? So usually our strategy is to talk about us trying to raise funds through angels or VCs or applying to different funding agencies. Is that the right strategy, or is there a more polished version of that answer?
Yeah, well, interesting question for sure. I mean, for me, what I always think of and what I tell people that I talk to when I talk to companies, I always say this in relation to funding is that um, when you're applying, the best projects are the ones that you're going to do anyways. So they're ones that, as an organization, you're going to do. You kind of you've made that strategic decision. You want to invest in this. So how do you come up with, you're going to do it anyways, but maybe how do you come up with funds to offset the cost of that so you don't have to pay for the full investment or pay for it all on your own? Those are the best projects. If you don't do that, oftentimes what I see is people are trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, like creating a project to fit a funding program. And then that's when you could get into, okay, well, how are we going to pay this? Or maybe you don't have the funds. So one I would say is like the best projects are the ones you're going to do anyways, and you have the funds for. So your answer could be, we're looking to acquire the funds to offset the cost of this. But we have the cash flow available to cover either our leveraging piece of this or other sources that we can secure. But yeah, I think it's tough because as a startup, you're not going to have a lot of that cash flow, and to be relying on the government funding can be difficult. But the best projects are the ones you were going to do anyways. You have the cash, but then you're just looking to offset the cost.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so any other questions?
I have a question related to opportunity management.
Mhm.
Could you mention an example of opportunity exploited? Because it got my attention that sometimes in the project you are seeking that the risk happened. So could you mention an example?
Okay, so so the example of the IP is a good one where you're sharing. Yeah, exploiting, it's tough to even imagine. It would have to be like, what is your your business or your project per se?
We handle projects related to software implementation.
Oh, okay. Okay. So what I would say, I guess, what I would say if you're looking for opportunity to exploit, again, if you went back to that SWOT analysis that I did, or like if companies, you have a SWOT analysis, you have a strategic plan, the opportunities, those ones that you've identified, you could go through and choose one that you wish to exploit. So those opportunities, so strengths, weaknesses, like I said, are internal usually. Opportunities and threats are external type things. So it would be something external to the organization that might be an opportunity, like say a new sector or market that you wanted to pursue. That's an opportunity. There's some risk involved with it for sure, but you say, okay, we're going to go after, dental offices. And that's where we want to develop our tool for that. That's an opportunity we've identified. It's a big market. And so we want to exploit that, and we're going to actively do that. So that kind of would become like a mini project for sure, but part of your operational, goals and objectives as well. Does that help?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would say that's where you would draw from totally. So you've done that planning. Those opportunities are there. Which ones do you want to exploit? When you're talking about project management in particular, like one specific project, it gets a little bit difficult in the beginning to know while you're planning what opportunities might occur to exploit. But on the operational and strategic side, it's more straightforward. Okay. I know we had an hour and a half, but I didn't think we would probably need the full hour and a half. I don't know. Are you there, Amanda?
I'm right here. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So, yeah, I guess if there's no other questions, we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, Cher.
Jem has a
Jem
question.
has a question. All right.
Hi, hi everyone. Good morning.
Morning.
Mine is very generic question. Like I'm not yet in this kind of industry, but I'm hoping to get into it, and that's why I joined this class today because it really always interested me. So maybe my question is more so like if my background is very much in technology and like I do support projects with startups and stuff too, but not as a person that is like like involved with management basically.
Okay.
Um, my question being is like if I am someone that wants to start and go pursue this career, where can I start, or what's the first step you would suggest or maybe advise for me to do, or like to go from where I'm at? Thank you.
Yeah, to pursue which type of career? Sorry.
Project management, risk assessment, basically, because it always have
Oh, okay.
interest me.
Yeah, well, for project management, and I've said this to a lot of people, the PMP certification is very valuable. Like you see that, it's impressive when people see that on your resume. So if you want to get into project management, um, definitely the PMP certification is worth its weight in gold, and it's also very accessible. There's online courses. You can work through that in a reasonable amount of time. So I think, and it's not only it's what I say about project management in general. If your question is general about project management, is that like for me, I've been doing project management for years and years, but I've never had that in my title. Like the skills for project management are so transferable, and any job that any of us do, we're all going to be doing project management. So these are skills that are valuable to anybody. And even the PMP certification, getting that helps you in any career and very transferable to anything that you end up doing. So, I mean, it's very valuable. I mean, there are introduction to project management courses, but that PMP just really does seem to hold a lot of weight.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll just make note, just in case anybody didn't see it in the chat there, Ursa just put in that she did a PMP course from Obio, that you can get the hours needed.
Nice. Ursa, do you want to share your experience? Like, did you think it was valuable, or do you see that that is impressive to people when you talk to them about it?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And it was like a crash course, so it was a full week, where it was 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 every day. And pretty intense, but I think, I mean, I don't have the certification, but if I remember correctly, and you can correct me, that you do need some training hours, course hours that you have to get to be able to then do the test. So that was like an accredited way to be able to do that, and it was just a week. And yeah, I mean, very detailed and lots of cases, and so that really helped. Like we had our own sort of project, so it was very sort of hands-on in that sense. And we had to develop a whole plan based on a specific project. So it was very like real world application, I guess, and very useful.
Yeah, that's the thing with project management too. The easiest way to learn it is by like doing it, like doing a project, going through the tools. I imagine with the course that you did too, like what I talked about here is very high level, and even what I teach at Loyalist for intro to project management just scratches the surface. But then when you get into the PMP type stuff, they, all the stuff that I talked about here looks very intro. They get down into the nitty gritty and a whole layer of technicalities that I haven't covered. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Ursa. Great.
Any
So I
other
think
questions? We're good.
no, I hope this was helpful. And so even if you took one thing away or there's one tool that you think you're going to use in your future, what I would say, Prashant, too, is that in those sections where you're identifying the risks or doing that kind of risk planning in the grant applications, what I've noticed, what I always tell people is a table is the best form to display that, because when the reviewers go to review it, if there's like a big long narrative that they have to read and it's not easy for them to consume, then they might not quite understand it. But if you have it in that table, it's easy to see, it's easy for them to understand and consume, and usually makes the reviewers very happy.
Thanks, Cher. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Cher, so there was just another question in the comments here from Erin. She says, we run an automotive shop. How are you encouraging people to plan for the tariffs?
Yeah, I would never encourage anybody how to plan for that. I don't know. Yeah, it's a wild card. Like I would know. I think it would be different by sector too. Like it's going to be different by sector or by industry on how to plan. And nobody could plan for this. Like it came out of the blue just within the last, couple of months. So this is one of those really unexpected ones that no matter how much planning you did and how many planning documents you had and how many risks you've assessed, nobody saw this coming. So the only way I would say is like how to plan for it is as soon as you hear about it, start thinking about it and start coming up with all those scenarios and the what ifs and identify how it's going to affect you specifically, which ones then do the assessment, which ones are very likely or not, and what the impact would be. Yeah, it's like as soon as something like that pops up, start the planning, think about the what ifs, how you're going to do it, and then really it's about this question came up. I don't know, was that a board meeting I was at or somewhere? There was like a little bit of a poll about how do you think people are going to respond? Are they going to be innovative, be a little more innovative, or are they going to diversify their supply chain? Or are they going to look for new customers? Are they going to make everything local? So again, it's about thinking about those responses. So I think it's not any one of those, it's a combination of, there's going to be these tariffs. You're going to have to be innovative. You may have to look for new suppliers. You're going to have to, it's going to be time consuming. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Cher. Erin just, she put in the chat there. Thank you for the affirmation.
Okay.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Cher. This was really great, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and lead this talk this morning. And great questions from everybody. We always like to see participants asking questions. So yeah, I will follow this workshop up with the link once I have it uploaded to our YouTube channel for everybody who's registered. I'm also just going to make a quick note that next month we're holding a bookkeeping workshop from St. Lawrence College. Their Spark Studios will be putting that on for us. And then in March, we're doing another presentation on crisis communications, which I think will be a nice follow-up to this one. It kind of drills down from project management to risk management to, what happens if one of those risks does happen and how do you communicate that out? So yeah, if you're part of our SUP program, or you opted into our SciTech News Digest when you register for this workshop, you'll be getting the registration links for both of those workshops as well. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, anybody, please reach out anytime. I'm happy to have a chat.
Have a
Take
great day,
care. Have a
everyone.
good week.
Thank you, Amanda.
Good
Thank you,
weekend.
Cher.
Thank you, everyone.